Warning. This podcast contains material that may or may not be considered appropriate for the average Trumptopian household. Listen at your own risk to unauthorized and explicit reading. Disclaimer. All rights to literature referenced are retained by appropriate entities, and no infringement is intended. The reading of any and all literary materials referenced herein is done expressly for the altruistic purpose of genuinely facilitating the species-wide, pineal gland activating, third eye opening, transcendent spiritual enlightenment of all of humanity. Any and all opinions expressed herein are exclusively those of the imaginary talk show host, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo. And now, brace yourselves for unauthorized and explicit readings.
Hello, and welcome back. Let's jump right in. On page 93 of Karen Armstrong's History of God, we were reading that later Christians would need to give a more theoretical account of their faith and would develop a passion for theological debate that is unique in the history of world religion. Put a pin in that. We're going to talk about that in some future episodes. Theological debate. We have seen, for example, that there was no official orthodoxy in Judaism, but that ideas about God were essentially private matters. In other words, in all the texts that Judaism referenced, in all the oral tradition that Judaism referenced, there was no definition of what God is. You were left to your own private relationship with God. She continues, the early Christians would have shared this attitude. Why? Because Jesus wasn't a Christian, he was a Jew. He wasn't even just a Jew. As Lars Moll explores in his book, he was a Nazarene mystic. But that's a whole nother episode, I think. I've talked about it in previous episodes, so dig that up if you haven't heard it yet. Continuing with Karen Armstrong, page 94. During the 2nd century, however, some pagan converts to Christianity tried to reach out to their unbelieving neighbors in order to show that their religion was not a destructive breach with tradition. Isn't that always where shit just goes haywire? When your well-intentioned, converted religious neighbors decide to turn to you and say, hey, why aren't you doing things this way? Because you can do it and not breach your tradition, right? Continuing with Karen Armstrong. One of the first of these apologists was Justin of, I don't know how to pronounce that. It's a place and it's spelled C-A-E-S-A-R-E-A. It sounds like Caesar with Caesar inside of it, mixed up like some sort of Caesar salad. And he apparently lived from 1000 to 165. That's A.D. Anno Domino. Anni Domino or Anno Domini? I forget which. It's been a long time since I studied Latin. Okay, so He died a martyr for his faith. In his restless search for meaning, we can sense the spiritual anxiety of the period. Justin was neither a profound nor brilliant thinker. Before turning to Christianity, he had sat at the feet of a Stoic and at a peripatetic philosopher. That's a word I don't know, and it's not capitalized, so it's not like a category. Peripatetic. Peripatetic. I'll dig that up for a future episode. A philosopher. And a Pythagorean, as in Pythagoras, but he had clearly failed to understand what was involved in their systems. This guy, Justin of Caesarea, of Caesarean section, that's what it sounds like. I can't not say section after Caesarean, and it's not even the word I'm reading, but I digress. I hope that was funny. He lacked the temperament and intelligence for philosophy, but seemed to need more than the worship of cult and ritual. He found his solution in Christianity, which was at that point only just beginning to transition from spiritual, mystic, private, oral practice and tradition to more of an organized network of different communities that thought and practiced along the same lines, but also had different weird, nuanced differences. In his Tu Apologia, which is the Latin term for apologetics, which is an essay that explains something so that it is less offensive, which is just fucking humorous to me. Circa 150 or 155, he argued that Christians, this is 155 years after Christ's death. So it took a bit before they were called Christians, because they weren't called Christians in Christ's time, really. We just assumed they were. But I digress. Christians were simply following Plato. I'll read that sentence to you again. He argued that Christians were simply following Plato, who had also maintained that there was only one God. Both the Greek philosophers and the Jewish prophets had foretold the coming of Christ, an argument which would have impressed the pagans. Coming of Christ, an argument which would have impressed the pagans of his day, since there was a fresh enthusiasm for oracles. He also argued that Jesus was the incarnation, and here's where we get to the teaser I left at the beginning, or at the end of the last episode. Jesus was the incarnation of the Logos. Now, a lot of things are going to sit well with you or radically change depending on what you think Logos means. Some people think Logos means the law, as in God's law. I can assure you, and you can go and verify this for yourself, that that's something that Logos was edited and altered to, much late in the whole cycle of editing and corruption of holy text. So that's not what it actually meant. That's not what it actually means, because I think Logos is an actual phenomena in the universe, not some theoretical, philosophical, fanciful hippie notion. It's a thing, like the sun. We just don't know where it is or how to see it. But I digress. He argued that Jesus was the incarnation of the Logos, or divine reason, which the Stoics had seen in the order of the cosmos. The Logos had been active in the world throughout history, inspiring the Greeks and the Hebrews alike. He did not, this guy, Justin Caesarian section, he did not, however, explain the implications of this somewhat novel idea. How could a human being incarnate the Logos? Was the Logos the same as such biblical images as word or wisdom, otherwise known as Sophia, a woman's name? What? We'll put a pin in that, right, folks? We're going to put a pin in that and come back to Sophia, wisdom, and womanhood in a future episode. What was its relation to the quote-unquote one God ? Logos. If you go to a Catholic priest, a non-denominational bishop, a pastor from some hokey-dokey local place, a Jewish rabbi, and a Muslim cleric, and insert 15 other labels here, and ask them what the Logos is, or better yet, if you want to kind of give them a little bit of a catfishy, sort of misguided, let yourself fall into your own trap, ego trap sort of, question, what was logo? What was the logo? Logos. What was Logos? And they'll give you all kinds of rambling, waxing philosophical, and if they're even remotely well educated, it will begin to approach what Miss Armstrong is talking about here. But it will radically exclude certain things, like its ubiquitousness. Logos is ubiquitous in the cosmos. It exists at all places, at all times, at all everythings, all dimensions. And it is, according to some radical thinkers, source. All right, let us return to Karen Armstrong and wrap this reading up for this particular section. Continuing on. Other Christians were developing far more radical theologies, not out of love of speculation for its own sake, but to assuage a profound anxiety. To assuage a profound anxiety. Are you suffering from anxiety, friends? Is our day and age nothing but hypersensitive anxiety all the time about everything? Tune in then. Focus down. Let's go. What is this? Profound anxiety. In particular, the Gnostokiai, the knowing ones, turned from philosophy to mythology to explain their acute sense of separation from the divine. Their myths confronted... Wait, hold on, before I go on. Separation from the divine. That is the root source of anxiety? What? Then I don't think any of the drugs they ever prescribed us would ever help, would they? If the root source of our anxiety as a human species is a separation from the divine, then I don't think any pharmacological bullshit pharmacology is ever going to help that. Odds are all it's doing is separating us further from the divine. But I digress. That was my own opinion. Let's return to Karen Armstrong. See what she's got to say about all that. Separation from the divine. Their myths confronted their ignorance about God and the divine, which they clearly experienced as a source of grief and shame. Basilides, who taught in Alexandria between 130 and 160, and his contemporary Valentinus, maybe, just maybe, the originator of Valentine's Day, who left Egypt to teach Rome, both acquired a huge following and showed that many of the people who converted to Christianity felt lost, adrift, and radically displaced. The Gnostics, excuse me, I butchered that. The Gnostics all began with an utterly incomprehensible reality, which they called Godhead. And since it was the source of the lesser being that we call God, it was incomprehensible. There was nothing at all that we could say about it, since it entirely eludes the grasp of our limited minds. As Valentinus explained, the Godhead was perfect and pre-existent, dwelling in indivisible and unnameable heights. This is the pre-beginning and forefather and depth. It is uncontainable and invisible, eternal, ungenerated. It is quiet and deep solitude for infinite aeons. With it was thought, which was also called grace and silence. When in your entire life have you heard the word thought called grace and silence? We're talking about a really remote and distant era of Christian thinking that's got nothing to do with the way Christians think today. And maybe that's what's wrong with the world, right? I digress, though. And we're going to wrap this up and move on to the other books. Men, continuing with Karen Armstrong's words, from page 95. Men have always speculated about this absolute, but none of their explanations have been adequate. It is impossible to describe the Godhead, which is neither, quote, good, nor, quote, evil, and cannot even be said to, quote, exist. Basilides taught that in the beginning there had been not God, but only the Godhead, which, strictly speaking, was capital N nothing, because it did not exist in any sense that we can understand. But as this capital N nothingness had wished, volition, desire, choice, this nothingness had wished to make itself known, and was not content to remain alone in depth and silence, then there was an inner revolution. An inner revolution in the depths of its unfathomable being, which resulted in a series of emanations similar to those described in the ancient pagan mythologies. The first of these emanations was the, quote, God, which we know and pray to. Yet even, quote, God was inaccessible to us and needed further elucidation. Consequently, new emanations proceeded from God in pairs. Insert here a little bit of commentary from my own. Sacred geometry. Singularity unfolds to prescribe a space within which that singularity can know itself, and the only way that singularity can know itself within that space, it has imaginarily transcribed, which cannot exist because all that there was a singularity. It then begins to divide itself, to unfold in an infinite fractal within this finite defined womb space so that it may create. That's what sacred geometry has to teach you. Don't know that yet? Double down on your readings on sacred geometry. Where were we? Which strictly speaking, nothing, because it could only exist in a sense we understand. But this nothingness had wished to make itself known and was not content to remain alone in depth and silence. There was an inner revolution in the depths of its unfathomable being, which resulted in a series of emanations. Similar to those described in the ancient pagan mythologies, the first of these emanations was the, quote, God, which we know and pray to. Yet, even God was inaccessible to us and needed further elucidation. Consequently, new emanations proceeded from God in pairs, each of which expressed one of his divine attributes. Quote, God lay beyond gender, but, as in the Enuma Elish, each pair of the emanations consisted of a male and a female, a scheme which attempted to neutralize the masculine tenor of the more conventional monotheism. Each pair of emanations grew weaker and more attenuated, since they were getting even further from their divine source. Starting to sound familiar, folks? That was me interjecting. Continuing on with Karen Armstrong. Finally, when 30 such emanations, or aeons, had emerged, the process stopped, and the divine world, the pleroma, which was complete. The Gnostics were not proposing an entirely outrageous cosmology, since everybody believed that the cosmos was teeming with such aeons, demons, and spiritual powers. St. Paul had referred to thrones, dominations, sovereignties, and powers, while the philosophers had believed that these invisible powers were the ancient gods and had made them intermediaries between man and the one. I'm almost at the end of this passage, but I think you're getting the reason why I had to put these all together. I didn't plan this. Anyways, there had been a catastrophe, a primal fall. Sound familiar? Which the Gnostics described. This is all before Jesus was born, before the Bible was written. The Gnostics described in various ways. Some said that Sophia, God's feminine wisdom, the last of the emanations, fell from grace because she aspired to a forbidden knowledge of the inaccessible Godhead. Again, are you hearing echoes of the familiar? Because of her overwhelming, continuing with Karen Armstrong's words, because of her overwhelming presumption. And don't worry, the story gets better, because Karen Armstrong is not a feminist. In case you were wondering. Because of her overwhelming, because of, I thought it was overwhelming, but now it seems like it's overweening. Because of her overweening presumption, she had fallen from the pleroma, and her grief and distress had formed the world of matter. She was matrix, the mother, the form giver. Look up the word matrix. It's got nothing to do with computers, folks. Computer people borrowed that word. Matrix has existed since long before all your fancy bullshit political ideology was ever made up. And it's more important than whether you're red or blue or purple. So I return to this. Exiled and lost, Sophia had wandered through the cosmos, yearning to return to her divine source. This amalgam of Oriental and pagan ideas expressed the Gnostics' profound sense that our world was in some sense a perversion of the celestial, born of ignorance and dislocation. Other Gnostics thought that, quote, God had not created the material world since he could have nothing to do with base matter. This had been the work of one of the aeons, which they called the demiurgos, or the creator. He had become envious of God and aspired to be the center of the pleroma. Consequently, he fell and had created the world in a fit of defiance. Sound familiar? As Valentinus explained, he had made heaven, quote, made heaven without knowledge. He formed man in ignorance of man. What? He formed man in ignorance of man. And yet in the Bible it clearly says that God made man in our image. Plural, multiple gods. Put a pin in that, my friends. In ignorance of man, he brought earth to light without understanding earth. Put a pin in that. He brought earth to light without understanding earth. But the capital L Logos, another of the aeons, had come to the rescue and descended to earth, assuming the physical appearance of Yeshua, Christos, Jesus, in order to teach men and women the way back to the unity that we call God. That was my adaptation. She just called it God. But it makes sense, right, what I added? I continue with her actual words. Eventually, this type of Christianity, here, this is important to understand. Before we move on to this next bit, let's recap what just happened. There was an era in Christianity where it was understood that Jesus was a meta-archon, a meta-being, an energy construct that existed beyond your physical body, and that it came here to this material realm and merged with one of our material bodies in order to teach us how to go back to the light. As it still says in the post-NIV, and I don't know what the most recent watered-down version of the Bible, how far away it's gotten, but I know that for a long time this passage survived. If thine eyes be singular, then thy body shall be made of light. A red line quote from Jesus. Not somewhere else in the Bible. Christos said that. So, page 96, Karen Armstrong's The History of God. But the capital L Logos, one of the aeons, had come to the rescue and descended to earth, assuming the physical appearance of Jesus in order to teach men and women the way back to God. Eventually, this type of Christianity would be suppressed. But we shall see that centuries later, Jews, Christians, and Muslims would return to this type of mythology, finding that it expressed their religious experience of God more accurately than the orthodoxy of their current theology. The myths were never intended as literal accounts of creation and salvation. They were symbolic expressions of an inner truth. Quote, the thing we call God and the pleroma were not external realities out there, but were to be found within. And she quotes, and I don't know where she's quoting from right now because it's just got a footnote and I don't know where the footnote is, but it says, abandon the search for God and the creation and other matters of similar sort. Look for him by taking yourself as the starting point. Learn who it is within you, makes everything his own, and says, my God, my mind, my thought, my soul, my body. Learn the sources of sorrow, joy, hate, and love. Learn how it happens that one watches without willing, loves without willing. If you carefully investigate these matters, you will find him in yourself. Footnote 36. One of these days, maybe 30 footnotes. Notes for, here we go. This is, what chapter is this? I don't know, line to 36. Notes for chapter, I don't know which chapter this is. I'm in the footnotes looking for my chapter. Oh, light to the Gentiles. Where's a light to the Gentiles? Footnote for a light to the Gentiles. The titles are, by the way, as I flipped through the footnote pages of Karen Armstrong's The History of God, in the beginning, chapter 2, one God, chapter 3, a light to the Gentiles, there I am. And the footnote, I'm still in chapter 3, page 96. The footnote is page 36. Footnote 36, Hippolytus in Heresies, chapter 8, page 15, chapters 1 through 2. That's what I just read. If you carefully investigate these matters, you will find him in yourself. If you look to the least, this is me adding, quoting from memory, one of my favorite iterations of the Bible, I don't remember which one, but this is the way it's always stuck in my head. If you look to the least of your brothers in your eyes, see my face. That's Jesus speaking in my interjection. I continue and wrap up with this particular passage. The pleroma represented a map of the soul. I couldn't wrap up this reading without getting to this part because everyone's been wondering, what the fuck is the pleroma? The pleroma represented a map of the soul. The divine light could be discerned even in this dark world if the Gnostic knew where to look. During the primal fall of either Sophia or the Demiurge, some divine sparks had also fallen from the pleroma and had been trapped in matter. The Gnostic could find a divine spark in his own soul and could become aware of a divine element within himself which would help him or her find his way home. The Gnostics showed that many of the new converts to Christianity were not satisfied with the traditional idea of God which they had inherited from Judaism. They did not experience the world as, quote, good, the work of a benevolent deity. A similar dualism and dislocation marked the doctrine of Marcion from 100 to 165, who founded his own rival church in Rome and attracted a huge following. Mind you, no one knows that name today. Marcion, 100 to 165. Huge following. Huger than Jesus. Huger than Jesus. Trump doesn't know who he is. Sorry for trumping Trump's Trump. Had to throw it in there. Because he loves the Bible so hard. I wonder what he thinks of this stuff from the Bible that I'm telling him about that he's not listening to. Continuing on with Karen Armstrong, Jesus had said that a sound tree produced good fruit. 37. Luke 6:43. So don't doubt her. She knows where it's at. A sound tree can produce good fruit. How could the world have been created by a good God when it was manifestly full of evil and pain? Marcion was also appalled by the Jewish scriptures, which seemed to describe a harsh, cruel God who exterminated whole populations in his passion for, quote, justice. He decided that it was this Jewish God who was, quote, lustful for war inconsistent with his attitudes, and self-contradictory. Footnote 38, which is Irenaeus, Hersias, Book 1, Chapter 27, Paragraph 2, perhaps? I don't know. Everybody's book's numbers can be different. So, contradictory, who had created this world. But Jesus had revealed that another God existed, who had never been mentioned by the Jewish scriptures, which is something they don't really help you understand nowadays. I interject. This second God was, quote, placid, mild, and simply good and excellent. 39. Tertullian against Marcion, 161. Interesting. This secondary God was placid, mild, and simply good and excellent. He was entirely different from the cruel, juridical, as in like jurisprudence, creator of the world. He should, therefore, turn away from the world, which, since it has nothing to do, since it was not doing, could tell us nothing about his benevolent deity, and should also reject the Old Testament, concentrating simply upon those New Testament books which had preserved the spirit of Jesus. The popularity of Marcion's teachings showed that he had voiced a common anxiety. At one time, it seemed as though he were about to found a separate church. He had put his finger on something important that the Christian experience. Generations of Christians had found it difficult to relate positively to the material world. Whoa, what? Let me read that again. He had put his finger on something important in the Christian experience of his day and time. Generations of Christians have found it difficult to relate positively to the material world. Donald Trump, the first Christian president that rode down a golden escalator and shits in a gold-plated toilet, would disagree with that statement, wouldn't he? Really hard, as he waved his Bible he'd probably never cracked open before in his life. Let me read that again. He decided that it was this Jewish God who was, quote, lustful for God and inconsistent in his attitudes and self-contradictory, who had created the world. But Jesus had revealed that another God existed who had never been mentioned by the Jewish scriptures. This second God was placid, mild, and simply good and excellent. He was entirely different from the cruel, juridical creator of the world. We should therefore turn away from the world, which, since it was not his doing, could tell us nothing about his benevolent deity, and should also reject the Old Testament, concentrating simply upon those New Testament books which had preserved the spirit of Jesus. The popularity of Marcion's teachings showed that he had voiced a common anxiety. At one time, it seemed as though he were about to found a separate church. He had put his finger on something important, the Christian experience. Generations of Christians have found it difficult to relate positively to the material world, and there are still a significant number who do not know what to make of the Hebrew God. I'm going to stop there because we can go on for days with Karen Armstrong. She goes on to some other really interesting things to comment about the development of our really weird and flat and two-dimensional and judgy and hate you and shove hot iron spikes up your butt idea of what God is nowadays. The kind of God that we know today in the common rhetoric did not exist in the days we were just exploring. In Christ's time and in the time of those who tried to write down the oral tradition of what Christ had taught, there was no curly-haired, sandal-footed, berobed old grandpa guy that was going to either bring you into the pearly gates or shove you on a shish kebab with 20 other people and rotisserie you for eternity. That idea did not exist. Or if it did, it was totally different. It was so different we wouldn't understand it today. I digress. We have so much more to get through. And I need a little bit of throat coat so that I don't stall out the way I did at the end of the last episode. Page 111 of Alan Watts' The Way of Zen. Picking up in the middle of a discussion about Buddhist virtues, how they're understood, and how they're explained. This could mean no more than that they were for mature people who have mastered the ordinary social and moral conventions and are therefore not in danger of using Buddhism, insert your favorite religion here, is my interjection, as a pretext for rebellion against the common decencies. Wait, what? Most of the postmodern Christian rhetoric is about getting in everybody's grills and not allowing anyone to have common decencies. But I digress. Not to sound like I'm out to fucking nail it to postmodern Christianity, because I am. I mean, I'm not. But it's out to destroy itself. I digress to the next paragraph. Alternatively, it could have been assumed that the type of zazen under criticism is zazen practice for a purpose, to, quote, get Buddhahood, instead of, quote, sitting to just sit. Zazen is the original word that we just shortened to Zen for sitting meditation. So there was an era where this was becoming so popular that it was critiqued as a cop-out. Continuing with Alan Watts. This would concur with the Soto objection to the Rinzai school with its method of cultivating a state of great doubt by means of the koan. While the Soto was not quite fair to the Rinzai in this respect, this would certainly be a plausible interpretation of the early masters' doctrine. However, there are several references to the idea that prolonged sitting is not much better than being dead. There is, of course, a proper place for sitting, along with standing, walking, and laying. But to imagine that sitting contains some special virtue is, quote, attachment to form. Thus, in the Tang Ching Huingnang, it says, a living man who sits and does not lie down. A dead man who lies down and does not sit. After all, these are just empty skeletons. Even in Japanese Zen, one occasionally encounters a Zen practice which lays no special emphasis upon zazen, but rather stresses the use of one's ordinary work as the means of meditation, This was certainly true of Benkai. I'm interjecting here. This was certainly true of Jesus Christ. Why did he teach a man to fish? If it wasn't to connect to the universe, be one with it, understand that life consumes life, and then be able to provide yourself that which you need to consume so you may continue being life. But I digress. Alan Watts says, this was certainly true of the Bankai, and this principle by the way, my pronunciation is not to be taken as well-educated or accurate. It's just my best guess, and I'm probably horrible at it. That was me interjecting. This was certainly true of Bankai, and this principle underlies the common use of such arts as tea ceremony, flute playing, brush drawing, archery, fencing, jiu-jitsu, and other things as ways of practicing Zen. Do you understand? Like, all these other things were not the thing. They were the way to practice the thing. So that means all the things you do, no matter what they are, even if you don't like them, you can if you choose. This is me interjecting here. This is not Alan Watts, but he's going to get to the same point in a hot second, I'm pretty sure. Even plunging the toilet, doing the dishes, brushing your teeth, going to that horrible job that you don't like, if you choose to approach it as if it were Zen, then it shall be Zen. I continue with Alan Watts' words. Perhaps then, the exaggeration of Zazen in later times is part and parcel of the conversion of the Zen monastery into a boys' training school. To have them sit still for hours on end under the watchful eyes of monitors with sticks is certainly a sure method of keeping them out of mischief. See Suzuki 10, page 176 to 180. Now, why did I get us to there? That's evidentiary reference to the slow, ponderous, decades long, centuries long hijacking. Because what happens when you, instead of practicing yoga, are making sure that kids aren't destroying the yoga studio? You're not practicing yoga anymore. No offense to the kids, no offense to the fact that they should be not destroying the yoga studio, but if you've transformed your entire practice of yoga so that all it is preventing the bull from destroying the china shop, then it's not what it was before, is it? This is me still, not Alan Watts. I'm just dropping things in that make sense. Maybe it's not even me, maybe it's some other source. But all organized religions have been hijacked. It's one of my oldest memes. It's one of my fewest responded to memes, but it's one of the hardest truths we all need to cope with. Because whether you're religious or not, whether you're spiritual or not, there are millions upon millions upon millions upon millions of your clones, or your brothers and sisters, or of your mirror namaste fellow avatars that are indoctrinated and imprisoned by ideological mental slavery of all the religions that are no longer spiritual practices out there. And here's evidence to it happening to all of them, as Alan Watts reports to us. Let us continue, page 112. And this is the end of the chapter, and we get to part 2 of the book. Yet, however much Zazen may have been exaggerated in the Far East, a certain amount of sitting to just sit might well be the best thing in the world for the jittery minds and agitated bodies of Europeans and Americans, provided they do not use it as a method for turning themselves into Buddhas. Everything's an ego trap. That's my interpretation of that. The litmus test is, will you do the spiritual work and become the Buddha? Or will you do stuff and say things because you think that will make you the Buddha? And then be basically a dog chasing his own tail around, or a cat chasing a laser beam around. That's the test. That's the pop quiz we're all failing. We have been. Up until about 2016, I know that sounds really counterintuitive. We were failing it so hard. I think we're now finally turning it around, folks, despite the fact that 45 is in office and represents the absolute total clusterfuck of failure that is our merry-go-round, meat grinder, ego fucking masturbatory experiment we call benign, mundane, material realm life. I digress. We've come to the final passage I had selected in the ways I've already over-explained to you. So let's fucking power through it. Gary Zukav, The Dancing Woolly Masters, a new introduction by the author. I'm not going to read that. I had landed on page so-and-so, right over here. Here it is. 245, a chapter called The Dance. I'm going to start in the middle of the page, in the middle of a quote within the page, because the setup there is way too dense to even get into, but the aha moment is like right around the corner. I think you'll be able to follow along, because I know what comes before, and I'll try to pepper in the info that you are not getting from the actual text. But it's also really well written, so don't worry. In Space-Time, wrote de Broglie, don't know how to pronounce that. It's a scientist's name, lowercase de, as in of, and then the last name Brogie, lie, de Broglie. In Space-Time, wrote de Broglie, everything which for each of us constitutes the past, the present, the future, is given in block. Each observer, as his time passes, discovers, so to speak, new slices of space-time, which appear to him, insert or her, continuing, as successive aspects of the material world, though in reality the ensemble of events constituting space-time exist prior to his knowledge of them. There's a foot reference to where that comes from, but I'm not going to dig it up because I'm running out of steam, folks. I want to get through this. So the rest of this is a bit of a dialogue. Quote, "Wait a minute," says Jim DeWitt to a passing particle physicist. "It is easy to talk of movement backward and forward in time, but I never have experienced going backward in time. If particles can travel backward in time, why can't I travel backward in time?" End quote. The answer which physicists give to this question is actually quite simple. There is a growing tendency in any closed part of the universe, their explanation goes, for disorder, called, quote, entropy, to expand at the price of order, called negentropy. Suppose, for example, that we deposit a drop of black ink into a glass of clear water. Initially, its presence is quite ordered. That is, all of the molecules of ink are located in one small area and clearly segregated from the molecules of clear water. As time passes, however, natural molecular motion will cause the black ink molecules steadily to intersperse with the clear water molecules until they are distributed evenly throughout the glass, resulting in a murky, homogeneous liquid with no structure or order whatever, only a bland uniformity, which is called maximal entropy. Experience has taught us to associate increasing entropy with the forward movement of time. If we see a movie of a glass of murky water becoming clear and clear and clear until all of the foreign substance in it collects into one drop at the top, we know at once that the film is running backwards. Of course, it is theoretically possible for this to happen, but it is also improbable that it simply never probably will happen. In short, time flows in the direction of high probability, which is the direction of increasing entropy. The theory of growing disorder, or quote, increasing entropy, is called the second law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics is statistical. That means that it will not work unless there are many entities in a given situation to apply to it. Generally speaking, individual subatomic particles are conceived as such conceptually isolated, short-lived entities that the second law of thermodynamics does not apply to them. Footmark. It does apply, however, to molecules which are quite complex compared to subatomic particles. Let me go back to the footnotes here. The Hagedorn theory of very high energy collisions uses the second law of thermodynamics. Okay, good to know. That was a little asterisk there. The second asterisk was the time reversibility. Just time reversibility exists in potentia, i.e., the particles are represented by propagating wave functions. Time irreversibility is an artifact of the measurement process. I'm going to blow your whole universe open and stop the whole show for that footnote. Time reversibility exists in potentia, i.e., while the particles are represented by propagating wave functions. Time irreversibility is an artifact of the measurement process. Time doesn't exist. What we experience as our linear forward from birth to the grave arc of time is an artifact. In other words, a record, a slate, a hologram, an aberration caused by us measuring. What's measuring? Our consciousness. Well, no, it's a manifold process. The interface between the unity of consciousness, our manifold, like many-layered, sandwiched, multifaceted aspects of the phenomena we call individuated consciousness, which is actually many things happening at once, which connect all directly to the unity of consciousness, so that even those many things happening at once don't exist unto themselves. They are connected to the unity of consciousness, an extension of the unity of consciousness here into this multidimensional material plane, so that the unity of consciousness can simultaneously perceive and project that which it is perceiving. through us, the semi-autonomous movie cameras of God. My words, not Armstrong. So this thing that we were just talking about before I went on my tangent, the idea that generally speaking, individual subatomic particles are conceived as such conceptually isolated, short-lived entities that the second law of thermodynamics does not apply to them. But it does apply, however, to molecules, which are quite complex compared to subatomic particles, and to living cells, which are more complex than molecules, and to people who are made of billions of cells, which are made of gazillions of molecules. I added gazillions of molecules. Continuing with this is Gary Zukov. Sorry, I've been referencing the wrong author for a hot second. Continuing with Gary Zukov's words, it's just that it's late. I did this coming home from work on my birthday day, by the way. It's 12/12, ding, ding, ding. It was my birthday. It has been my birthday. It's been my birthday day. It's now my birthday week, all week. It's going to be my birthday month, all month. Please listen to my birthday episode and read my birthday posts. You know what I want for my birthday. Continuing on. It is only at the subatomic or quantum level that the forward flow of time loses its significance. However, there is speculation and some evidence that consciousness and the most fundamental levels... Oh wait, I read that a little bit wrong. However, there is speculation and some evidence that consciousness, at the most fundamental levels, italics for emphasis, is a quantum process. Let me say that a little bit clearer once again. There is evidence and growing scientific speculation that indicates that consciousness at its most fundamental level is a quantum process. By the way, Gary Zukov's The Dancing Woolly Masters was originally published in 1979 by William Morrow and Company. Let that blow your mind a little. Continuing on. Oh shit, where was I? Consciousness is a quantum process. Sound familiar? The dark adapted eye, for example, can detect a single photon, which arguably isn't supposed to be possible. If this is so, then it is conceivable that by expanding our awareness to include functions which normally lie beyond its parameters, parenthetical, the way yogis control their body temperature and pulse rate, and parenthetical, we can become aware of, parenthetical, experience that these processes, themselves. If, at the quantum level, the flow of time has no meaning, and if consciousness is fundamentally a similar process, and if we can become aware of these processes within ourselves, then also it is conceivable that we can experience timelessness. If we can experience the most fundamental functions of our psyche, and if they are quantum in nature, then it is possible that the ordinary conceptions of space and time might not apply to them at all, as they do not seem to apply to dreams. Such an experience would be difficult to describe rationally, infinity in a grain of sand, and eternity in an hour, but it would be very real indeed. For this reason, reports of time distortion and timelessness from gurus in the East and psychotropic drug users in the West ought not perhaps be discarded peremptorily. Subatomic particles do not just sit around being subatomic particles. That's the heaviest sentence yet. I'm going to interject. You can sit around all day on your couch one day, right? And not give two shits. Maybe not even have to actually physically go to the bathroom. And you're still you. You can just sit there all day and do nothing. The irony is you're not doing nothing. Even in your most abject, neglectful, I don't give a fuck, I'm just going to sit here and breathe. You're doing a bazillion things. You just don't choose to recognize them. Simultaneously, if you're consciously choosing to sit in stillness and silence in order to engage your internal phenomena, then just sitting there is so much more than doing nothing, isn't it? That's why I love that meme I made a few years ago. I had to repost it today because it came up, and it's my birthday, and it's one of my most favorite, even though it's long and long-winded. Go look at it on my Facebook. Something about how meditation is better than all these other things. Blah, blah, blah. I digress. Let's wrap this reading up real quick here. We're almost there. Where were we? One second. A little throat coat. So that I can get through this last bit of reading. Thank you for putting up with that. Future listeners will be glad to not have to listen to me drink water and throat coaty things and put them down and adjust my chair. Subatomic particles do not just sit around being subatomic particles. They are beehives of activity. An electron, for example, constantly is emitting and absorbing photons. These photons are not full-fledged photons, however. They are now you see it, now you don't variety. They are exactly like real photons, except that they don't fly off on their own. They are reabsorbed by the electron almost as soon as they are emitted. Therefore, they are called virtual photons. Virtual means being so in effect or essence, although not in actual fact. They are virtually photons. The only thing that keeps them from being full-fledged photons is their abrupt reabsorption by the electron that emits them. Footnote. From one point of view, virtual photons differ from real ones in that their rest mass is not zero. Only zero rest mass photons can escape. There are two ways of looking at virtual photons mathematically. In the first, old-fashioned perturbation, I can't pronounce that word, Perturbation theory, the mass of a virtual particle is the same as the mass of a real particle, but energy is not conserved. In the second, the Feynman perturbation theory, same word, can't pronounce it, just spelled it, don't need to spell it again, but it's added with the name of somebody who adjusted it, I guess. Feynman, Feynman. The energy momentum is exactly conserved, but the virtual particles do not have physical mass. A square is not a rectangle, but a rectangle is a square. No, square is a rectangle, but a rectangle is not a square. Things can be more things than they are and overlap and yet be completely different things. In other words, there is an electron, then there is an electron and a photon, and then there is an electron again. This situation is, of course, a violation of the conservation of law. Is a violation of the conservation law of mass energy. The conservation law of mass energy says, in effect, that we cannot get something for nothing. According to quantum field theory, however, we do get something for nothing, but only for about 1,000 trillionths of a second. In typical atomic process, high-energy virtual photons have even shorter lifetimes, the footnote reads. The reason that this can happen, according to the theory, is the famous Heisenberg uncertainty. I butchered it. The Heisenberg uncertainty principle. Now here we come a little bit full circle because I've already talked about that like episodes ago. We're spiraling around the drain, folks. The Heisenberg uncertainty principle. It's getting late. My mouth is falling apart. I'm just tired. I should have been in bed about 40 minutes ago. But I'm going to finish this because God said I had to. The Heisenberg... I'm sorry, that was there to see who caught it. The Heisenberg uncertainty principle, as it originally was formulated, says that more certain we are of the position of a particle, the less certain we can be about its momentum, and the other way around. We can determine a position precisely, but in that case, we cannot determine the momentum at all. If we choose to measure its momentum precisely, then we will not be able to know where it is located at all. In addition to the reciprocal uncertainty of position and momentum, there is also a reciprocal uncertainty of time and energy. The less uncertainty there is about the time involved in a subatomic event, the more uncertainty there is about the energy involved in the event, and the other way around. A measurement as accurate as 1,000 trillionth of a second leaves very little uncertainty. Excuse me. Just talk myself hoarse. Probability waveform uncertainty. Hydration. A measurement as accurate as 1,000 trillionth of a second leaves very little uncertainty about the time involved in the emission and absorption of a virtual photon. It does, however, cause a specific uncertainty about how much energy was involved. Because of this uncertainty, the balance books kept by the conservation law of mass energy are not upset. Said another way, the event happens and is over so quickly that the electron can get away with it. It is as if the policeman who enforces the conservation law of mass energy turns his back on violations if they happen quickly enough. However, the more flagrant the violation, the more quickly it must happen. If we provide the necessary energy for a virtual photon to become a real photon without violating the conservation law of mass energy, it does just that. That is why an excited electron emits a real photon. An excited electron is an electron that is in an energy level higher than its ground state. An electron's ground state is its lowest energy level, where it is as close to the nucleus of an atom as it can get. The only photons that electrons emit when they are in their ground state are virtual photons, which they immediately reabsorb so as to not violate the conservation of law of mass energy. This goes on for days, but I wanted to get that bit about somehow for that to all make sense, something needs to be observing. It's as if a policeman who enforces the conservation law of mass energy then chooses to turn his back. Right? Like, that's a willing participant. That brings us back to consciousness. Somewhere in many books of physics, there's several references to how the founding fathers of modern physics strove really hard to draw conclusions that did not necessitate some kind of being beyond the realm of physics to manage the laws. But ultimately, they all conformed to this one they all fell victim to this problem, which was expressed eloquently by some person or another whose name I don't have in front of me right now. But it goes like this. The first sip from the water glass of science will lead you away from God. The more you drink, the further away you are led, until about halfway through it changes. And then, as you approach the bottom of the glass, you find yourself returning to God. Now, that was my butchered paraphrasing of it, but look it up. Type in glass, science, sip, water, God, and you'll find the actual quote. I totally just butchered the paraphrasing of it. I've rambled on for way too long, and I've got way too early of a day tomorrow to even feel comfortable rationalizing talking any further. But this part of the episode was longer than the first half of the episode, so I feel bad. But here you are, my friends. That's it. Part 1 and Part 2 of my first active attempt at a sort of philosophical bibliomancy. I wanted to see what words connect in your mind. I don't even remember what I read right now, honestly. If someone asked me right now, someone who'd been here the whole time taking notes, asked me, because I just did this back-to-back recording, and for those of you who might have listened live, you know that that's true. Back-to-back recordings, readings from pages that I selected at random after having meditated and prayed to the God in all of us, and the Father and the Mother in that God, to find words that connected for you. If that person who I just described was here listening to all that and then started to ask me some questions about what I just said in a sort of like, now the pop quiz, prove you memorized that, or that you know what that means, I probably wouldn't be able to answer it. I can't remember what I interjected. I can't remember. This had to happen because it had to happen. I worked a full day's work earlier, and it's my birthday, and I drove an hour and a half home. My only objective was to come home, meditate, and go to sleep. Instead, I did this. So, and I'm not complaining. What I'm saying is that's my body of proof that I'm not crazy, I think. It's meaningful. It's my body of proof that I'm not paid, because every word I just said to you about my day is true. I went to work. I did my job, which I love, and I came home, and I did not, it's my birthday, and I did not want to spend more than 4 hours rambling until I'm hoarse in the mouth and can't talk anymore. But I did anyways, because Mother Earth and Father Time asked me to, because they're really concerned about our species. Thanks for listening, folks. Until next time, I have been your humble, slightly absent-minded and eccentric Christian, mystic, Buddhist, coexistist, everythingist anti-ismist. I'm gonna anti-ismismist. There's my new religion. We are anti-ismists. Thanks for joining.